published the CYCLOPE report on the state of world markets, and you agreed to share your view of what's coming up in the next few months in economic terms with us. You have the floor. Thank you very much, and it is for me a great pleasure to be back after a few years to this maritime insurance event, PARIS-DAUPHINE. It's true that circumstances are quite peculiar because, let's say things as they are, the world is undergoing a true shock connected on the one hand to the pandemic, don't forget that, and on the other hand, what you've talked about at length, the war in Ukraine. The pandemic that prevented us from meeting in the last few years, let's remember that this is the most severe pandemic that the world has known in the last century. The Spanish influenza, exactly 1 century ago, killed 50 to 100 million people on a total population of 1.5 billion human beings. So it was much more devastating. Now, let's not look at official figures, but let's look at assessments made in terms of excess mortality. There were probably 25 million deaths on a population of 7 billion people. But with the communication around this pandemic, the special precautions and lockdown measures caused the biggest economic decline in 2020 that the world has known since the 1929 crisis. So a major pandemic, a pandemic that's not over. As you all know, zero COVID is still the order of the day in China, and even in France we're seeing a new surge. I can't see a lot of masks in the room. Maybe in the next few days we'll need to go back to this very sad habit. So pandemic on the one hand, war on the other hand. I'll remind you that we are faced with the most severe traditional war that Europe has known, at least since the Second World War. Pandemic plus war, in my view, and that's my view as a historian, that's my thesis, and so as any thesis, it's up for discussion. I think that we are faced with a major crisis, a crisis that's somewhat equivalent to what the world went through in the 30s, then the 70s. One of these key moments that makes a mark on a geopolitical and economic history of the planet. In the 1930s, I won't come back over that, but this was a symbolic end of liberalism, the rise towards the Second World War, and everything that marked the post-Second World War aspects, period, the glorious 30, as we call them, between 1950 and 1980. And so the 70s were sort of the end of the post-war boom. You'll remember that there were the oil crises, the end of the Bretton Woods system, and the decade ended with a long period of stagflation. And paradoxically, that called into question what worked well during the post-war boom, so the social market economy, and all that was concluded with a sort of return of liberalism, the Thatcher, Reagan, and Mitterrand years, and a whole swath of deregulation that prepared for another booming 30s, with in 1990 the end of Soviet communism, the continuation of China's opening, and so roughly between 1990 and 2020 we had a glorious 30 years, what I would call the globalization, the happy globalization 30s. So globalization was control over the globe. For the first time, that's something that Fernand Braudel cared about, the notion of world space that he theorized around Venice, Antwerp, and Amsterdam. The world space was covering the whole planet for the first time. And so people, humans, were the masters of real time and space, and you benefited a lot with these successions of vessels crisscrossing the planets, allowing us to manage value chains at the scale of the planet. And so this was another industrial revolution, chips, genes, and also a period of a return to a market economy. It felt as if between the globe, chips, and genes, we had found a sort of ideal recipe that would allow us to imagine that the world had put an end to these horrible periods. Remember, at the beginning of this century, US philosopher Francis Fukuyama wrote a book about the end of history. So we thought that we'd reached the end of history, the end of the fairy tale. The prince and the princess were happy ever after. And so we thought that this was the end of history because happy people have no stories. We dreamt that the 21st century would be that of the end of history. So yes, of course, we could have already seen a number of cracks. The 2008 crisis, we talked about it a few years ago already, but we could see there the excesses of financial speculation, a few brats playing with algorithms on financial markets, and so all that was fairly quickly forgotten. But yet we could have noticed that these emerging countries, the BRICS, as we call them, remember this acronym started by Goldman Sachs, well, maybe that was not all that great. Brazil was sort of shaking. Russia was an oil emirate. South Africa had not really started taking off. But yes, you still had China and India, and especially China, which was driving the whole world economy. And so the manufacturing machine in China was a guarantee of ever lower prices for our manufactured goods. And now the current crisis, the pandemic plus war, well, suddenly these characteristics of globalization burst apart. The world is no longer unified, it's fully fractured. And these are fractures that will endure probably after the war has ended. On television news channels over the past 2 years, we saw medical professors explaining what would happen with COVID. Now we have retired generals explaining what's going on in Ukraine. And so, well, it doesn't all seem very serious, but what we can be sure about is that this unified world space is completely fractured. You have the side of despots and autocrats on the one hand, and on the other hand, that of freedom. Global governance has all but disappeared. Maybe some of you have noticed that 10 days ago there was the plenary conference of the World Trade Organization. It went completely unnoticed apart from some congestion in downtown Geneva because there's hardly any more content in the WTO. The G7 that was supposed, and I think it ended yesterday, that was supposed to manage world affairs now is only one side of the planet. And you can see that when I'm speaking, of course, of this fractured globe, you can see all the bottlenecks that there are in transport chains. I think that you've talked about the container markets and all that, and not just price increases and bottlenecks, the fact that value chains themselves are fully called into question, and technology itself is being disputed. On the one hand, because the people who dreamt of eternal life are now faced with silly viruses. And so the very ability of people to manage pandemics is called into question. And not to mention the climate crisis, which is constantly challenging our growth models. And this is something that we can see in passing in the ballot boxes of many countries. And so the market economy itself is called into question because of the stronger role of public authorities, the stronger role of governments in the economic management of the country, and also these waves of populism that have submerged many of our democracies. So in a way, we are faced with a major break that I would tend to compare to what we saw in the 1970s. Now, what could come out of that? In the short term, I won't venture to make geopolitical forecasts. I absolutely do not know. And I think that no one here, well, we may have opinions, of course, but no one can see how we can exit this crisis in Ukraine. And maybe it will become a trench war with an almost total blockage of the coastline on the Black Sea. And there's also Taiwan. There's a major meeting of the Chinese Communist Party in the autumn where Xi Jinping is totally going to change the rules of the game established by Deng Xiaoping, where a government in China could not stay for more than 2 5-year terms. For 10 years, you had Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, and normally you can't imagine that Xi Jinping is going to leave the stage in September. It's absolutely not the case. So that's a return of Chinese despotism with the desire to make a nationalistic comeback, also with tensions around Taiwan. And don't forget that in global geopolitics, we're all focusing on Ukraine, but don't forget that the Arab-Persian Gulf is not an area of love for your neighbor. There are tensions, and there's China's rise in Africa, and Latin America is following an economic pathway that we could be worried about. And in the longer term, let's call a spade a spade. We're in a situation of stagflation, quite obviously. We were a bit too euphoric last year, 2020, the global economic downturn. 2021, it's picking back up with a vengeance. The money taps were open, and so we returned to growth levels that we hadn't seen so far. And so we imagined that we would come back to the good old days and everything would happen without any problems. No, not at all. We are coming back down to earth, and it's difficult. Everybody's now anticipating a recession in the US next year. You saw the forecast. A French economic growth, 2.5 this year, according to the Bank of France, 1.3 next year. We're coming back to poor levels of growth, around 1 or 2%. Even at the same time as because of the energy shock and the commodity shock, but also because of the demand shock, we are seeing an inflationary surge. Many countries, developed, advanced countries, are now dealing with 10% inflation. France is slightly below that. The outlook is roughly 7% by year end. Low growth, strong inflation, that's what we call stagflation. For those of you who were born in my generation, stagflation is what we went through at the end of the 70s. And that lasted for the better part of the 80s. So from the short term, I'm going to go to the midterm. In the midterm, what we're identifying is mostly a change in the economic model. The time when we thought that everything had to go through the market's logic, the times when we only talked about deregulation, including for essential goods, like electricity, for instance. Well, now all that is called into question because of the government's comeback and the prominence of public policy. In my view, it's a major shift, just as the 1930s put an end to liberalism and the 1970s paved the way for liberalism again. And so I think that the 2020s will be marked by a decline of the market economy and greater intervention at very different levels, but intervention by governments. But what's also clear, and that could be the positive aspect. The accumulation of crises is probably going to force us to accelerate our transitions, economic ones, but also environmental ones, as well as energy transitions. And this is mostly driven by the persistence of crises. So coming back to commodities, raw materials that I care so strongly about, what's important is to notice that these markets are a reflection of planetary tensions. Now we're undergoing 4 crises which build this system. You know, in philosophy, every element of the system exists in its interrelation with others. This is what's happening. There's a logistical, an energy, an industrial, and an agricultural crisis. I'm going to say a few words about each. Just to remind you that, yes, of course, I think that you focused this morning on the Ukrainian crisis, but it all started long before that. Just looking back, the average prices in 2021 compared to the average prices in 2020, the natural gas prices in Europe had risen by 397%. On average, the price of container freight increased by 297%, and so on and so forth. The price of food products increased by 64%. So you need to put things back in context. So yes, of course, Ukraine worsened, compounded the problems when it comes to energy, and symbolically when it comes to agricultural products. There were consequences on some industrial products markets like steel, and the ASVO metal plant of Mariupol produced 4 million tons of steel a year. And so now it's not going to produce anymore. And all that explains the tensions that we can see on a number of industrial commodities. But Ukraine is not everything. You need to put it back into a wider context. Looking back at the 4 crises very quickly, the logistical crisis, you know it. For years we were able to have value chains. We could import products and spare parts. When a 40-foot box between China and Europe cost $1,000 to $1,500. Now it's $8,000 to $10,000, and so this has called into question all the value chains that so far allowed us to enjoy manufactured goods at lower and lower prices. I won't dwell on that, but keep in mind that this logistical crisis is probably here to stay, and it's going to stay longer. And in the field of containers, Ukraine has no responsibility whatsoever. Then the energy crisis, what's original about it is that unlike the 70s, when it originated with oil, the 2 oil crises, now what we are going through mostly is a gas crisis. It's all the more important, especially for Europe, because Europe had made gas, especially Russian gas, the central element in its energy transition strategy. There was a lot of ideology around it, I admit, because we decided that nuclear was bad, that shale gas was bad, that we tried to exit coal. So we try to invest very much on renewables, but renewables, well, the technologies do not allow us to store enough electricity. So the problem with renewables is that they're intermittent. So then we had to rely on another energy source in order to ensure we had basic production, and so that energy source would be natural gas. Since we had our Russian neighbors, they were nice people, and they kept gas prices at very favorable levels. Well, we could rely on Russian gas. So we put ourselves into a situation where Europe put its head on the chopping block of Russian gas, and when Putin came with the axe, well, there was nothing more we could do. You'll understand that. So now the situation is extremely tense. Quite logically, because of sanctions, we'll try to do without Russian gas, but unfortunately for those of you who insure LNG tankers, you know that the LNG market is very difficult. It depends on Asian demand and European demand. And even if we were able to get LNG, we have issues with regasification capacity and even network problems for next autumn. If we're able to fill our tanks, we'll have issues with transport of gas within Europe, and so you can never rule out maybe not a shortage, but at least some limits on the use by certain industrial sectors, especially in countries like Germany. You should expect that. You probably all read the editorial by the three CEOs of Total Energies, EDF, and Engie in Journal du Dimanche this Sunday, urging us to be a bit more reasonable in our consumption. I'll remind you, for those of you in France and looking at your bill, electricity bill, now you're paying your electricity at 70 euros per megawatt hour, whereas the bulk market, the wholesale market, is between 200 and 300 euros. It's great to cap gas prices as we are doing now, but you should also remember that we're trying to cap it at 40 euros per megawatt hour on the free market. It's sold at 113 euros, and in March and during MAD periods, it reached 350 euros. There are, of course, consequences on power prices, consequences on the price of fertilizers, and of course, that will have an impact on the agricultural situation, and also consequences on the oil market. Let's remember also, originally in 2021, it wasn't really an oil crisis. Now it's extremely complex because I think that you no longer insure oil tankers with Russian oil. It's all very good, but the end result is that it's going to reduce Russian exports and even Russian oil output. And the result is that the market is going to be imbalanced. OPEC countries said, that's not our business. We're not going to compensate the lost production from Russia. So now oil is still in fairly reasonable prices, between 110 or 120 dollars a barrel, but you could imagine future tensions and in a not too distant future. Now we're at the heart of a major energy crisis, and you need to be aware of that. Oil, the price that you're paying at the pump, well, that's maybe just the tip of the iceberg. And that goes to show that it's necessary in Europe to redefine our energy transition, because right now we want to be always greener, but we've reached a paradox, and now we are coming back to dirty coal. This wonderful paradox that you're closing down a nuclear power station in Fessenheim and you're reopening a coal-fired plant nearby. And so there's also a third crisis, an industrial one, because all the markets are recovering and industrial demand is recovering. In 2021, yes, I can see you. I know what you're going to say. I'm getting there. Don't worry. It's 26 past. I still have a few minutes. Please. 30? Until half past. Maybe a bit more. Okay. So an industrial crisis, given tensions related to the energy transition on tensions on a number of metals that are electric metals, surging prices. If you rode an e-bike here, that's great, but in your battery there's lithium. The price of lithium tripled, that of cobalt doubled, that of nickel went crazy in March, over $100,000 per ton. But even for basic products, if you want to build a house now, you'll see the cost of rebar, the price of wood, the price of cement, even energy prices. So you can see that there are lots of tensions on all of these markets. Well, fortunately, right now it seems to get a bit better with the slowdown of the Chinese economy because of COVID and their zero COVID policy. Now, an important aside, because many of you also insure bulk ships transporting cereals and grain. There was a lot of coverage in the press on the global food crisis related to Ukraine. Bullshit. It's not related to Ukraine. It dates back to last spring, the rise of China as the #1 global importer of cereals. It imported 17 million tons of cereals in 2019. It was 60 last year, out of a market of 350 million tons. So there are price tensions that we can feel in our countries, but let's not exaggerate. But it's felt much more severely in a lot of countries. A wheat importer like Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Sub-Saharan Africa, they would pay $150 per ton more for their tons of wheat. That could be Russian wheat that manages to get out. Now, it's not really a problem for Ukraine. It's not wheat. Out of the 20 million tons that are still in silos that could have been exported, only 5 million tons of there's 5 million tons of wheat. The rest is corn that Chinese or Spanish pigs won't be able to eat. So let's gloss over that. And I'm reaching the outlook very, very quickly, of course. What outlook in view of all that? An economist sometimes has to be honest. I agree. It's not always a natural thing for us. So I have to make a number of caveats. Of course, there's the geopolitical situation and also the health situation. My dear friends, is it the end of the Greek alphabet for variants? I don't know. It's possible that there will be a further wave of COVID, so we can always get boosted. It's always useful. And then the climate uncertainty, not just for farming. What about next winter? That's when we wish that temperatures have risen enough to avoid us using too much electricity to heat our houses next winter. And then, having made these 3 caveats, what can we put forward as options? One that directly impacts you. The logistical crisis is here to stay. You know how long it takes to build new port infrastructure and to have the necessary staff. So the logistical crisis could stretch until 2024. The energy crisis, on the one hand, we're going to have strong tension, and we can see that tensions on oil. Some of my colleagues are anticipating that oil will reach $175 a barrel. Anything is possible between $100 and $200. You can see the implications. The real crisis is that of gas. Will we be short on gas this winter? Maybe not. Anyway, it will be more expensive. Times when natural gas was at around 10 euros a megawatt hour, those days are over. Will probably stay around 50 to 60 in the best situation. So for those of you who use gas, well, for gas and for electricity, that will be very bad for the energy bill of companies, of course, although this is going to accelerate the energy transition.
When it comes to the agricultural crisis, it will depend on the climate. You can pray that it rains this summer on the Great Plains in the U.S., so there's a good soybean and corn harvest. With the slowdown in China, in terms of industry, prices may drop a little bit. But don't forget one more thing, which concerns we Europeans. All this is paid in dollars. And in 2008, when oil was worth $167, the euro was much stronger. And now the dollar and the euro are on a par, so we pay more for our gas at the stations. I think, therefore, we are at a time of major upheaval and disruption. If I read things properly, this crisis, as of 2020, is part of history like the crisis in the 70s. It took nearly 10 years to emerge from that preceding crisis. We will emerge from it, but with a different model, with more state and more transition, which is positive. And I do sense an increase in the idea of commonweal. That's the positive side. The negative side is that we live in a fractured world. There are a lot of ever more despots and autocrats. The end of history? Well, I don't know. I think for a time we'll have to forget the better world. I publish the CYCLOPE report every year. This year we entitled the report using Stefan Zweig's last book, which was written in 41-42, just before he committed suicide in Brazil. He talked about the world of yesterday. Yes, to a certain extent, don't dream about going back to the past world. Meditate on this quote from Shakespeare and Richard III. He said, "Sudden tempests are short." Yes, we are in a tempest. It will come to an end. But after the tempest, light rain is much lengthier. And it's a time of light rain that may open up for a couple of years to come. I apologize to conclude on this somewhat pessimistic note. I do believe I'm fairly realistic. However, thank you for your attention.